I've moved out of the state of New Jersey about 3 years ago. I closed my brick and mortar and I do telemed only. I specialize in the treatment of anxiety spectrum disorders like OCD, panic attacks, generalized anxiety, PTSD, all of that kind of thing. But I did my postgraduate work in forgiveness as a psychological interest and what's called forgiveness therapy. I didn't even know there was such a thing. I kind of stumbled upon it when I was in graduate school. And I learned that there's a whole body of work, a whole body of researchers that focus on this elusive concept of forgiveness. So we're going to be talking about interpersonal forgiveness today, forgiveness between individuals for offenses, not about other kinds of forgiveness. This is purely a psychological review of what forgiveness means. It's not a theological review, even though that word has power in the world of theology, obviously. I'm just going to review. I'm going to point out that we have a guide. We have a handout in front of us, and I'm going to use that as our guide as we go through this today. So I'm just going to ask everybody to focus on these guidelines. There's sort of norms and ways of operating through this very personal topic. And the first one just summarizes what I said, that this is interpersonal forgiveness that we're talking about. We are going to ask that, I am going to ask that your questions be transmitted to Nancy and that we address your questions at the end of the presentation. And in the third point, I do point out that this can be a very personal topic for people. It deals with interpersonal relationships, and those are what make us most human, and those are what are most powerful and can be most painful. And as a result of that, I ask everybody, it seems like you all know each other. There's a cohesion. I feel it and see it between what Nancy has said and what I'm seeing just in the pre-presentation interaction. So you probably have your own code of operating, but I'm going to ask that you regard what's said here by others in a confidential nature. Obviously, there's no privilege going on here, strict professional client privilege, because this is an open format and it's a group format. But I ask you to regard what people share or even implications and questions with some confidentiality and understanding that they may be revealing intentionally or otherwise some deeply felt emotional wounds. I'd like you to focus on the last part, which is that it's not necessary that you have a specific offending event, although, to be human means we have these things, we sort of gather these things in our lives, whether we want to or not. But much of the work in forgiveness does deal with intimate wounds, personal wounds. It's not the exclusive focus of the work in forgiveness, but it's the big bang. There are some kind of clever quotes at the end of each page, and I find them to be useful to read. They're like the poetry to the thing. This is science, social science, psychology, but it's also part art. And I don't have all the answers to every question when we're dealing with the part art, part science, which is really what all psychology is, part art, part science. It's part of that sort of undefinable human qualities, along with the empirical stuff, the empirical research that helps us in the world of psychology, help people do better, feel better, operate better in the world, live better lives. This presentation is divided into three big topics. What is forgiveness? Why forgive? And then how to forgive. And so we're going to start with, what do we mean by this word? This is a word that people use all the time. They use it in discussing, things at work, things at home, multi-dimensions. Many people use it. We mentioned that it's loaded with theological implications. People use it in temples and churches. I don't know what theologians specifically mean about it. I haven't truly studied that in depth. I've studied the psychology of it and what psychologists mean. So I'd like to point out that there are notable psychological forgiveness research banks, and they are throughout the country, actually throughout the world. Robert Enright is regarded as the father of the forgiveness movement. He did the first, quantifiable deep data gather on what forgiveness was, who was forgiving, who wasn't forgiving. And that was back in the mid-'80s. So forgiveness has been around, forgiveness therapy has been around for some time now. He's written a number of books on it. Fred Luskin is a great name. You can YouTube him. He's got a number of YouTubes up and TED Talks. He was a TED Talk guest. He's got a good book, as do the rest of these people listed here. Even though this isn't theological, I like to point out to Desmond Tutu's name, the bishop, the highly esteemed Reverend Dr. Tutu, who did a lot of work on forgiveness that informed his Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa. There's also the great Positive Psychology Institute that was founded by Martin Seligman out at UPenn, that's still operating. They do a lot of work on forgiveness and ancillary issues like happiness and things like that. And so I always put them in for good research if you want to do some follow-up look on your own. So forgiveness defined as a psychological construct. The first big component of what forgiveness is that it's a decision, it's intentional. One makes this conscious, deliberate decision to be a forgiver, to live in a state of forgiveness as opposed to a state of non-forgiveness. Many people choose not to forgive. I've had people come to seminars and say to me, I'm not forgiving. I decide not to forgive. And, that's a voluntary choice. There is a body of work, and we're going to get into it, that demonstrates that forgiveness is good for your health. We're going to talk about that. But, maybe forgiveness is not good for you or not right for you. It's a commitment and a voluntary act. So there's this volition thing to it. Sometimes people talk about the desire to forgive or a willingness to be willing to forgive. I've heard that term used quite often in theological realms because people want to be forgivers. They want to live in a state of forgiveness for a variety of reasons, but they're not there yet. So they're in sort of this pre-contemplative position of being willing to be willing to forgive. The seminal research-based definition is right there. We're on page 2, and it is this. I'm going to read it out loud. Forgiveness is the overcoming of negative affect and behaviors, including anger, bitterness, resentment, and retaliation we feel or do towards an offender, accomplished through the purposeful act of developing compassion, benevolence, neutrality, it's a big word, even love toward that offender, all the while being aware that our benevolence, compassion, love, and neutrality are gifts to which the offender has no right. I like that definition. That's been the definition for a number of years. It's been tweaked, and you get varieties of that in the literature and the research, but it's essentially the core elements. I particularly like the last line because we're not talking about what's just or what's equitable when we talk about forgiveness. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But it is an interior shift that involves both emotions and behaviors towards someone who has hurt us. Forgiveness is a process, as every therapeutic protocol is. It comes in these incremental movements towards, we're not robots. And like every big human experience, grief and love and depression and anxiety, forgiveness requires movements towards and away from the position of non-forgiveness. Forgiveness is unilateral. It has nothing to do with the other, which sounds weird, but it isn't. If you think about what we're all doing in therapy, we're learning new ways to interface with ourselves. We're learning how to relate to our own thoughts and feelings differently because the other person isn't there for the most part, or even if they are there, they've got their own inner life, their own interior states. And all we get to do in this world is try to influence what's going on inside of us, regardless of what's going on externally in the world. So I like to point out this myth of the bilateral transaction of forgiveness. And by the way, if you're lucky enough to be the recipient of what I'm about to discuss, then that's a wonderful thing. And the myth of the bilateral transaction is that someone asks to be forgiven. They come to you, they knock, and they say, I've done this awful thing, and I know it, and I'm very grievously sorry for it. And they fall on their knees and they ask if you will accept their forgiveness, and you do accept, and you restore the relationship with this hope, new codes, new rules, mutual goals. But in reality, for most people, that doesn't happen. And this is a really poignant quote I found from Beverly Flanagan. She's one of the authors and researchers in forgiveness. She's out at University of Wisconsin, and she writes, while forgiveness can be a method for which a wounded person readmits an offender, it is not possible to readmit someone who's not knocking. Most injurers not only do not knock, but they never turn around. They instead open new doors and step through them, leaving us in the dust. Most people are left to forgive alone, with little or no help from others. The wounded individual grapples with the betrayal and the hurt and the injustice, while the injurer moves on into other relationships, other friends, other circles, and other aspects of life. You are left to close the book alone. And in my work, and obviously in other people's work, that's the people who we see clinically who come in and want to move on in life. They usually don't come in saying, I want to forgive. They usually come in saying, I'm stuck. I'm stuck in something that life gave me that I don't deserve, that's really bad, and I don't feel good. And I don't find it to be simpatico with who I really am and who I want to be. So psychological researchers are social scientists, and scientific research defines things by ruling out what it is not. This was well portrayed in the TV show House. If anybody remembers that, I don't even know if it's still on TV, but House would get this big whiteboard out, and they'd write down, he and his team would write down every possible thing that could be the diagnosis for the person. House was kind of like, if you didn't know the show, he was kind of like the Columbo version to medicine. He operated like a detective to find out what was wrong with the person. They gave him the really complex cases that nobody else could figure out and diagnose accurately and treat right. So, he demonstrated well that really in all science, we're ruling things out and we get to what's left and we theorize, well, that's it. And that's true with science, always has been, always will be. Social science isn't any different in some respects. So we rule out what forgiveness isn't. We know that forgiveness is not reconciliation. Those are separate concepts. They're separate behaviors. They're separate interior states. Reconciliation is bilateral. Forgiveness is unilateral. Reconciliation usually requires what we hinted at before in that quote by Beverly Flanagan. It requires the establishment of a new moral code. And I'm going to use a word I don't really like, but some trust. And I don't like that word because I don't want to get into that too much, but we live in a very challenging existence here, and things fail, including human relationships. So I don't love the word trust, but I do want to point out that forgiveness is something that occurs inside of you, all alone inside of you, between you and your therapist, or between you alone, or between you and your whoever it is that's assisting you. Forgiveness is not forgetting, right? So we hear that a lot, forgive and forget. Forgiveness requires remembering, and in therapy, in forgiveness therapy, it actually requires dissecting the thing. And that's a very painful experience for people. We'll get to that in a little bit, but it is certainly not forgetting. It's remembering, learning, and moving past the thing. So forgiveness isn't justice, as I mentioned before. It doesn't equate with our normal notions of fair play and equity. You guys are lawyers, so that's a very hard thing sometimes for lawyers to accept, because you deal in trying to bring some justice and equity to the table. But this is something in a whole different realm. The research has shown that people who have justice as their top trait on the hierarchy level have a hard time with forgiveness. So we try to work to help people move that off of the top tier a little bit if they want to be forgivers, to sort of put it aside, suspend it, not entirely, but in some inner disposition. Forgiveness isn't pardon. Pardon connotes a whole other thing, a legal process and an analytical process. Forgiveness has more of an emotional component to it. And forgiveness isn't condoning. It's not the establishment of some kind of mental position or overt act where we somehow whitewash the bad thing that has occurred. A very good example of this is a woman named Eva Kor. I don't know if anybody's heard that name before. Eva Kor died just last year, actually. And I had the privilege of hearing her live in a presentation some time ago. She's written a book that was quite controversial called Forgiving Dr. Mengele. When she was a little girl living in Austria, she was imprisoned in Auschwitz in a concentration camp with her twin sister. And part of the infamous Mengele lab, where he experimented on twins in horrific ways. Her sister eventually died of her twin sister of what happened to her as a little girl. Eva and her sister were portrayed on the cover of Life magazine when the Allies freed that camp. There was a horrible picture, but a picture that is historically useful to see these people marching out of that hellhole. And she was at the front, and she and her sister were in these little black and white striped coverings, and twins behind them. And she goes on to tell how she eventually came to America. She married, she had a couple of kids. She became a realtor. She lived in Indiana. And she was an angry person. Who wouldn't be? But she got to this point. There's a film, there's a documentary on her life. And there's one scene in particular that really sticks in my imagination, in my mind, where she is depicted as showing a house to a young couple. She's a realtor. She's walking through the house, and you can hear her talking over this, but you see her showing the house, and it kind of gets dark and you just see silhouettes of people, and she's one of the silhouettes. And you hear her say, she got to the point in her life when she realized there was more to life than Auschwitz. It kind of blew my mind to hear a person say that, because it's so, all-encompassing, and it can be all-encompassing. And yet that was a pivot point for her. She realized that here she was in Indiana, and she was, you know, many years after, many decades after, and she had a husband and kids, and she was allowing, in some respects, and that I use that gently, but was allowing Mengele to live in her mind. He was still alive. He's been dead many years. She was allowing the experience to be very active in the front of her mind and controlling her life. She was kicking the dog. She was, you know, fighting with her husband, and wasn't, in her view, a very good mother to her children, and so forth. And she decided to embark on a journey of forgiveness. And she went to a therapist, and together she began to learn to forgive Mengele. If she can learn to forgive Mengele, and if you choose to forgive whoever hurt you, you know, I urge you to look her up and watch the documentary. I found her to be a very compelling person personally. Obviously, one has to be to do what she did. She's written the book. There's a documentary that was done on her life. She also did something very important, and it goes to this bit about condoning. She established in her town the Candles Museum, and it's an acronym for Children of Auschwitz and Nazi. I don't remember all the words right now, but it was a museum that was built by her through private funds and donations, which stood as a testimony to the horrors of the Holocaust and her personal experience. So I use her as the model for this because she certainly didn't condone. She pointed out through the museum how awful and horrific and evil life can be, and how awful it was for her personally. And yet she went on to forgive Mengele. Okay. Why forgive? Why do this thing, difficult thing, which seems to be antithetical to justice? Well, the research is showing it helps. One of the reasons people forgive is because morality shows that forgiveness is a virtue, that it's virtuous to be forgiving. If we don't forgive, we live in a state of non-forgiveness, or unforgiveness, sometimes is the term used in the literature. And that breeds other things. There tends to be a correlation between being in non-forgiveness and depression, and being in non-forgiveness and negative states that are sustained. So anger, bitterness, resentment are all appropriate emotions. We need to have these things. We must have these things. We Americans would not be Americans in this flawed but great nation, but for angry predecessors. These were, you know, essentially 5 angry men who started this nation. So, you know, these are emotions that can help us, but a lot of times they don't. And we get stuck in states that eat away at us. They impinge upon well-being and life satisfaction. They cause lack of sleep and things that bring people into therapists like me, like anxiety and depression. There's been a lot of work by the Templeton Institute, which studies virtue, and they have found that forgiveness is a virtue. One of the things they look at is the faith perspective, and the great monotheistic traditions all have forgiveness as a cornerstone. It varies depending on faith, and the specifics of that vary, and I can talk to people about that later if they want. But forgiveness is a moral virtue. Faith. So the Christian faith, I happen to be Christian, key concept. It happens to be key in the other 3 big monotheistic traditions. They ask adherents to be forgivers. Our health. The research has shown that people live longer and healthier lives if they forgive. That first study that Enright did back in 1985 was a group of women between the ages of 75 and 85 who had accumulated a lot of life hurts and were in their final chapter of life, and signed on for that a seminal study because something was aching inside as they were entering their final phase of life and contemplating death. And since that time, the research results there were that they had higher life satisfaction, higher levels of well-being, and less depression. And that's held. So I like to look at the research. I like to know, what's really helping people rather than what feels good at the moment. So, and that's what CBT is really all about, looking at the data. We can see from now a significant body of research that anxiety does go down, depression goes down, really hard to treat things like incest. Those people the victims of incest seem to be helped with forgiveness therapy. You can look at these yourself. Quality of relationships go up, marital relationships and other relationships, anger management. So I'll leave those for you to look at, but there is a whole body of research that supports that. So here's the bulk of what we're going to talk about. How do we do this? How do we forgive? If we've signed on to this for whatever reason that appeals to us and we want to be forgivers, how do we do this very hard thing? And the first part of the this section talks about that intentional commitment. So being a forgiver is not unlike being on Weight Watchers or some other long-term haul, right? So Weight Watchers is a very successful program for a lot of reasons. The research does support that people do better on that because it is a sustained haul. Same with AA. It's a day-by-day, long-term approach rather than a product that you implement in a month and there you have it. So forgiveness requires that decision phase, and it requires a lot of thought on the person who wants to be in. And there are things that aid in that, and I've listed a couple of those things that are therapeutical homework assignments, frankly, that people have to do to help them with this intentional commitment, to be of the mind, to be in forgiveness. I talk in that last section about that pre-contemplative stage, about willing to be willing to forgive. Desmond Tutu has the prayer before the prayer, and it hits on this notion about I'm not there yet, but I want to be there someday. I want to go towards that. But one of the things we do in therapy is have people commit in writing, just like a contract, a legal contract, with a witness. The witness can be someone that the person brings in, a trusted relative or friend, or it can be the therapist. But the person makes a pledge to live and strive to be in forgiveness as opposed to non-forgiveness. And it does require a reminder each day that you are in forgiveness. The research has shown that people who forgive a specific offending event tend to develop the trait of being forgiving. Forgiveness is not necessarily something that we humans are wired to do. There's a researcher by the name of Michael McCullough. I don't know if you've heard of him. He does podcasts, and you can YouTube him as well. He's got a couple of books out. He's got a new book about the kindness of strangers. And his research focuses on whether or not these sort of positive, if you will, traits and states are hardwired in us. Are we wired to forgive, or are we wired to be in a state of revenge? And, you know, his research is, I don't know, I read one thing he writes, and I think that he's concluded that we're hardwired towards it. And then I read his next research paper or his book, and I think, oh, it's not so settled. But the question remains on to whether or not we are wired to be forgiving. And some of the research shows that maybe that's not true. That if you're talking about the neural pathways, that maybe we have built in us some neural pathways to not forgive people, especially if they're not blood relatives. So if you think about what goes on in us human beings, we are wired to survival. The clan that we used to live among doesn't really exist anymore. So the clan can be our coworkers, or the clan can be our circle of friends, or it can be our church group, or it can be, you know, people who live across the country who we interface with via Zoom now. So it used to be, you know, this little nuclear group that more and more doesn't exist in our world. So those people are pretty easy to forgive because the case can be made that we need them. We need them for survival. We need them for planning how to provide ourselves with the essentials of life, like food and shelter. It's harder to forgive people who are outside that clan. So it does begin with this intentional commitment that is part of daily, like AA, a daily recommitment. The uncovering phase is the nut of the thing. It's the hard part of forgiveness. And it does require this going into what forgiveness is. So to my point before about forgiveness is not forgetting, this is the hard part of remembering, reliving, and uncovering. We do grievance narratives with people to really understand what they're forgiving through the grievance narrative. I treat anxiety. Every time someone comes in with a form of anxiety, and you know, anxiety manifests itself in a variety of forms. We really, what the core of what we're doing with people is teaching them to go towards the thing they're afraid of. So people have to go into the darkness with this protocol as well. They have to go towards the very thing that was very hurtful so that they can get to the other side of it. And that's because turning away or distraction from the thing only lasts so long. That's true with anxiety treatment, and it's true with this kind of work too. We can teach ourselves to sort of distract, or and there's value in that in some, to a certain degree, but unless we actually go into the darkness and get to the other side, these things tend to live inside of us. So the grievance narrative talks about what happened, who's responsible for this harm, identifying the individual. I find that often people realize there's more than one person responsible for harming them that they hadn't really thought about before. What specific episode engendered the feelings that you're having now? And what are those feelings? So being precise about that rather than just vague. And how have you been damaged? What happened in your life that's changed? And evaluating that damage. What did you hope for and what rule was broken? So in CBT, in cognitive behavioral work, we talk a lot about rules. These are mental constructs. These are things that we sort of develop or bring into relationships. They're statements about how the world should operate. I'm not suggesting that they're not understandable, but many times they're not rational. And by that, I mean rational in sort of a scientific way. Let me give you an example. One common rule, I'm just going to use a rule that we can all relate to. Parents should love their children. Well, that's not a rational rule. It's an understandable rule. And it's a reasonable rule, and it's a wonderful rule, but it's not a rational rule. And by that, I mean the data, the hard evidence doesn't really support that, because we can all probably conjure up in our mind examples when parents don't love their children, as bad as that is, as unfortunate and even horrific as that can be. And so I point that out, and that can be very hard for people to hear, but I point that out because these rules that we make, and to a certain extent help us some of the time, can be traps. They entrap us a lot of times too. And they can entrap us into unforgiveness if we adhere to that rule and hold really fast and tight to it. When we do these deep dives into what the thing is, one important question is to look at how we've changed. How do we see the world differently now? Sometimes that involves a more mature view of the reality and the rational evidence on this very fallen and difficult world in which we live. It's a beautiful world, but it's a very difficult world as well. Mental shifts occur. This cognitive disputation term is a clinical term that goes to what I just discussed about the trap of the rules. We begin to dispute the mental pieces, the I statements about what's happened to you, as well as those rules. And a good example of that is the data shows that every woman who is raped blames herself. She begins to evaluate her behavior, her choice of travel, the clothes she wore. Why? Why does the brain do that? No one deserves to be raped. So why would the brain go back in on itself and begin to evaluate these things and pick apart whatever a woman did? She doesn't deserve rape, right? She may have chosen her clothes poorly that night, or maybe she went down a street that is not a street that a woman should be on alone at night. I don't know, but they become sort of pieces of self-evidence for her that somehow she did this wrong, she deserved it, or something like that. It's a very curious thing that the human brain does, and we don't quite understand why the human brain does that fully. But when someone hurts us, it's useful to begin to identify the things we're saying to ourselves about ourselves that aren't true or aren't useful towards our goal. Truth and usefulness are two key questions we want to be asking us about the things we're thinking. This involves a deeper level of thought. We call it metacogniting, where we're thinking about our thinking. It's not something we do. We don't metacognate naturally, but it's a very useful thing to do, to stop and say, what am I thinking? What are the thoughts that are going through my brain right now? I like to talk about the structures we build in our thoughts, that sometimes there's a skyscraper in our brain, and we know what the top floors say, they're obvious. But do we know, as we go down the structure towards the primary floors, or even in the basement, do we know what we really are saying to ourselves, especially about what's called the core schema, the self-statements, the things we're saying to ourselves about ourselves? So we do that when we're trying to forgive. They're operating. I also like to refer to the double dip. Remember those candy apples you used to see on the boardwalk? I used to, they got sort of more sophisticated or more elaborate as I grew up. So you used to see the apple dipped in caramel, and then as marketers got more sophisticated, they then dip it in chocolate. And then they would dip it in vanilla on top of the chocolate, and then nuts on top of that. Well, that's what we do sometimes with ourselves, that we have this thing, whether it's a grievous event that's happened to us, and then we overlay it, we dip it into other things, self-blame, guilt, shame, all kinds of things that don't help. They waylay us, they don't move us towards our goals. And that's very, very common in forgiveness work. So we also look at these emotional shifts, and we seek to develop these emotional shifts in people. And one of them is this very hard bit about developing neutrality or love for the offender, empathy. We begin to see the offender in a new way, and not just in this isolated sort of freeze frame of this event, or maybe it's a series event, maybe it's a chronic hurt that has occurred. But we begin to develop that person in a more holistic way as a fully human person. I'm not, and this gets very complicated, and I'm not going to advocate for this necessarily. Again, this is a big piece of volition on the part of the client or the patient. Because there are gradations of how bad someone can be. There is, and I think it's at the end of this handout, a reference to a really good PBS series that Helen Whitney put on forgiveness, A Time to Heal and A Time to Hate. And in that documentary, which PBS aired, and if you go to the PBS site, you can look up Helen Whitney's work on forgiveness and watch it. It's really very well done. There is a vignette, there is a section on a woman who was nearly beheaded by a madman when she was a young girl on a cross-country trip. Her roommate was severely injured. The guy had an axe, and she talks about how after that event, she was urged to forgive and move on. And she did this very cursory forgiveness that came back to haunt her later in life. After a couple of divorces and a couple of failed girlfriendships and things like that, she ended up reevaluating that event and the impact it had on her, and this very superficial forgiveness that she, quote, bestowed upon this event and that person, and even the people in the town who she felt betrayed her. And she, dug deep into it. She went back to the town, she visited the site, and she came to realize, and these are her words, that there are some, that evil is real, and that there are some acts and people who are truly unforgivable. That's a very big question to me and to certain forgiveness researchers. It goes to the thing about why Eva Kor was so controversial. And it's sort of beyond my pay grade to develop that with you here today, but I do want to point that out, that there might be some acts that are so egregious and so evil that they're not purview for forgiveness therapy. And I really don't know what to say to that. Again, I point to that first step about forgiveness being an act of volition. And sometimes people have to get to that person very personally, but there's really no answer to that question. Eva Kor felt one way, and this woman, her name was Terry Jantz, came to a different conclusion. And that gets into a very philosophical place. But if you sign on to forgiveness, and if you want to be a forgiver, development of empathy and seeing your offender in a new light does become an important piece to it. It helps you depersonalize it. It helps you take one step backwards and sort of rise above the specific offending event and seeing in a more transcendent way this human being who hurt you and life in general, how unjust this life can be. In this section, I talk about the rift in the research on love versus neutrality. And there are certain researchers who say neutrality isn't enough to be in a state of forgiveness. I just point that out and I leave it at that. I personally have views on that, but I think you get where I'm going there. The last phase of forgiveness, this journey towards forgiveness, I'm aware of our time, it's a little after 1. So the The last phase of this journey is the deepening phase, and it involves a lot of the sister concepts that we borrow from positive psychology. Humility development being one, the recognition that we're part of this human story too, and that we can be crappy people at times. I know I can only speak for myself, and that I probably have hurt people that I haven't even realized I've hurt. And I know I've hurt people that I know. So that sense of being part of the human picture and developing a sense of humility can help. Being a meditator or a prayer to enhance the inner state is key, has helped many of my clients, has helped me personally. I will share that, and is mentioned time and time again in the research as a personal growth and deepening exercise. Gratitude, the development of a sense of being grateful for the good things that have happened in our lives, the beautiful parts of this world, gratitude journals, what went well lists, naming 3 good things each night before you put your head on the pillow, despite the bad things, trying to grapple with something that's gone well. Fred Luskin talks about some research he did that they brought over to Northern Ireland that is part of the curriculum in the schools in Northern Ireland to help breach the divides between the Catholics and the Protestants. Talks about having a group of mothers in a room, mothers who lost their sons to violence on the streets. The same work has been done in the West Bank as well, between the Palestinians and the Israelis. But Luskin talks about this specific example where he's had these mothers in forgiveness workshops in Northern Ireland where it rains, 27 out of 30 days. There happened to be one day when he could see the sun was coming out. He asked all the mothers to go stand along the windows. There were very big windows in this building he was in. He pulled the blinds up and the sun started to pour through, and everybody kind of went, oh. And he asked the mothers to just stand there and bathe in the sun for a minute and feel the warmth and to recognize that this world that took their son from them is also the world that was providing that warmth and sun, and that just nanosecond of good feeling, just to sort of take a chink out of the armor. So these little exercises go there. Gratitude letters have been demonstrated to be very, very useful for people. They take us away from the forgiveness work. It means you write a letter to someone, could be someone who isn't even alive anymore, but someone who helped you, not necessarily changed your life in a massive way, but changed your life in a little way. And for whom if you think about it, you feel very grateful to that person. And you put it down in paper, you actually write it out. You use cursive, if anybody knows what that is anymore. And you mail it to them, or if you don't want to do that, you can go down to the ocean and throw it in the water, but you write this out and you deliver it in some format. And the research is that has sustained value for people. And it sustains itself. So we're always looking not only on, do people feel good then, but do they feel good at a 3-month checkup and 6 months and 18 months thereafter? And these gratitude letters seem to really hold a lot of power. Optimism, we don't have enough time to get into that paradigm, the optimism versus pessimism, but that people begin to look at that bad thing through that prism. Is this a permanent mark on my life? Is it pervasive? Has it ruined every dimension of my life or not? And is it personal to me? Or does this happen to people generally? And building of resilience and grit, evaluating our grit. The grit scale is now used for entrance to West Point because grit, the ability to persevere through challenge, is a marker for success in life beyond these old entry exams. There's a famous researcher out at UPenn, Angela Duckworth, and she's done a lot of research on that. She's worthy of looking up. And then creative things, art classes, learning a new language, taking a trip. Not for the distraction, but truly for that personal growth, the ability to rise above and be something more than just the victim of a hurt. I do have references and further considerations for you, as well as those films. I just want to see if I have the PBS thing there. I do. It's the first one listed. If you're going to look at anything, look at the top 2 films and documentaries that are listed there. I see it's 1:08. So I'm out of time, but do we have time for questions and answers?
Yes, we do. And I'm going to end the recording at this point so the group can form back together. Anyone who's watching this as a video, please know you can call the 800 number for lawyers' assistance, 800-246-5527, if you need to know how to access the handout. And thank you.